Well, a very good evening, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, known as CAPI, at the University of Victoria. For those of you who don't know me, I'm CAPI's director, Victor Ramraj. And for those of you who might be joining a CAPI event for the first time, let me just say that we're a dynamic, interdisciplinary, Asia-focused research center located in Victoria, BC, on Canada's west coast and on Coast Salish territory. Although I'm not on the campus this evening, we do work from the University of Victoria's campus. So let me take a moment to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm delighted to welcome you to yet another exciting event organized by CAPI Senior Research Fellow, Global History Professor, and Canada Research Chair, Dr. Neilesh Bose. Dr. Bose, as many of you know, has organized numerous seminars and events for CAPI over the years under the banner of the South Asia Global Forum and the Global South Colloquium. Ever the innovator, Neilesh has this term launched another remarkable series called Punjab in the World: History, Politics, and Migration. In just a moment, Dr. Bose will introduce our speaker, Aanchal Malhotra, Remnants of Partition, Migration Histories, being the title of today's session. But before I turn things over to Neilesh, let me say briefly that I was speaking to a colleague today at a faculty event, and she mentioned to me that she was delighted to see that Dr. Malhotra was joining us, and told me how much.
Sorry, just miss, no doctor.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, she told me how much she relied on your work. And so on behalf of,
Thank you.
No, it was lovely. We had a great conversation, and she was really, I'm not sure if she was able to make it, but she told me how excited she was that you were joining CAPI. So on behalf of all of my colleagues, including the colleague who I spoke to this afternoon, let me extend to you our warmest congratulations on your book. And might I add, on your very elegant website, which is a terrific portal. It's a lovely portal into your remarkable projects, and I was sort of looking around, and it's really very impressive. So congratulations on that too. We're delighted and privileged that you're able to join us today from Delhi. So a very warm welcome to CAPI. And thank you again, Neilesh, for organizing this terrific event and the series. And over to you to introduce our guest and to moderate the session.
Thank you so much, Victor, for the introduction and for the welcome. Welcome, everyone. Good evening to those in the Pacific Coast. Good morning to those in India and elsewhere. Welcome to the 5th lecture in the Punjab in the World: History, Politics, and Migration series, which, as Victor mentioned, explores the modern history of the Punjab, as well as Punjabi migrations in global and transnational contexts. This series features scholars from a range of disciplines, such as those who work on the history of the Kingdom of Lahore, or the Sikh Empire, and its historic importance, the history of colonial Punjab, as we have heard about in the last few weeks, and also contemporary issues in popular and visual culture. This series is also a part of the Global South Colloquium, a seminar series now in its 6th year, which explores different aspects of the Global South from historical as well as contemporary perspectives. So as Victor mentioned, my name is Neilesh, and I am the convener of this series and the host of the program. I teach history at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and my own research features the cultural history of modern South Asia, the history of migrations, and aspects of global history. In keeping with recent tradition, our speaker will speak for the first part of the program for approximately 30 minutes, followed by an open Q&A moderated by myself. And we aim to end at approximately 8:30 p.m. Pacific time. When we open for Q&A, I'll ask everyone with questions to please use the digital hand raise function, and I will call on everybody in order. And just so everybody knows, the program is being recorded, and I will ask everyone to please ensure that their audio is turned off during the presentation. Now on to the main event. It is a great pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker, Ms. Aanchal Malhotra, an oral historian and writer from Delhi in India. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, a crowdsourced digital repository that traces family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and antiques from India and the broader Indian subcontinent. Her book was titled in South Asia, Remnants of a Separation, and internationally, Remnants of Partition. It was shortlisted for numerous prizes, including the Sahitya Academy Yuv Purushkar, the British Academy's Naif Alrodhan Prize, and the Komaladevi Chattopadhyay Prize, as well as others. Her upcoming work includes a book on the generational impact of partition, titled In the Language of Remembering, and a novel titled The Book of Everlasting Things. And I just, as another small note, she has numerous connections to Canada, which I hope also we will hear more about. We will turn to the Q&A at approximately 8:10 to 8:15 p.m. Pacific time, and we will endeavor to close the session by approximately 8:30 p.m. Pacific time. And at this moment, I would like to now turn the Zoom room over to Ms. Aanchal Malhotra.
Thank you so much for both those very kind introductions. I'm really so honored to be here. And the doctor versus Miss confusion is quite common. Makes me think I should almost get a doctorate to, so many people in the academic world have it. Anyway, well, I'm here joining you from Delhi, so it may get a bit noisy because I live at a T-junction, so please, sorry for that in advance. And as Neilesh mentioned, I have long ties to Canada. My grandfather migrated there in the late 1950s on a football scholarship to Guelph. And my mom was born and raised there. And I went to school at OCAD and Concordia for about 9 years cumulatively. So long family and academic ties. I've been following the lectures in this course, and the one thing that may be a little bit different today is from the rest of the series is that I am not an academic, and neither do I write academic history. I'm quite particular about being known as an oral historian, and the predominant subject of my work are the lives of people affected by the 1947 partition of British India. I believe you will be reading about partition tomorrow. And so what I will present in this lecture is an overview, a brief overview of the event, as well as my particular research methodology that focuses on oral and material culture, and why oral history is essential to our understanding of events like partition, cataclysmic in their scale that quite literally change the lives of millions of people. So I will now start sharing my screen. Is that good? Okay, excellent. So we understand the partition as looking something like this, a geographic and political vivisection of the Indian subcontinent into the independent nations of India and Pakistan in the year 1947. The withdrawal of the British Empire from India in August 1947 led to the drawing of what is called a Radcliffe Line on the west and eastern part of the subcontinent, forcing Hindus and Sikhs to migrate eastward and Muslims to migrate westward. And Pakistan later was further bifurcated into east and west. In this map on my screen, you can see the movement of refugees from one part of the subcontinent to the other. And I think partition is the largest mass migration of people perhaps till date in the world. It resulted in the displacement of 14 million people and the death of 1 million more as per official figures. I want to emphasize that when I was young, growing up in India, learning about partition in school, this is how it was taught to me. I was shown maps and figures. Partition bifurcated the provinces of Bengal and Punjab that are also on my screen. There are two maps showing how the territory was divided. And it was taught, partition was taught in as appendage to the Indian independence movement, something that happened as a part of the independence movement. Whereas it's quite important to acknowledge that independence and partition were two separate events and they register quite differently in the memories of those that witnessed them. Where there is the joy of freedom, there is the loss of partition. Where there is the pride of being a free nation, there is also the sadness of having witnessed loss and incredible horror of partition. I write on partition as a descendant of 4 refugees who migrated from what became Pakistan to India. But in familial memory, the word partition was barely ever uttered in my house. And I think part of the reason why I began writing about it and thinking about it was to understand this silence. So just to offer you some visual context, the next few slides are taken by the American photographer Margaret Bourke-White, who was one of the few people who was able to document partition as it was happening. She traveled to parts of the border and took photographs of people walking and people on trains. And these are perhaps the most comprehensive visual documentation of the actual act of migration. But I think sometimes what ends up happening is in the vastness of numbers, the singular story of the person who migrated is actually ignored or even inadequately represented, because there are tales of, as we can see in these images, they're just incredible humanity teeming, trying to get to safer parts of what is now the country that they have to adopt. And I think that it's, there are tales of horror, tales of murder, of family, tales of loss and land, divisions, migrations, displacements, confusions, reunions. And I think in all of this, what really ends up getting lost is the story of the one person, the feeling of the one person. As you can see, refugees migrating to both sides of the border, and on either side, the land sort of looks the same. So, and I'll get to this a little bit later in my presentation, also the similarity on both sides of the border, not just of landscape, but also of people and their living, how similar it is in India and Pakistan. So my first introduction to partition was actually photographs like this on novels about partition, whereas it really should have been family history and family story. Despite the sheer volume of information on the partition available to us today, we are actually 75 years on, still learning how to speak both thoroughly and sensitively about the event, how to encompass its many facets and countless individual accounts. And I feel like traditional means of narration have failed to do justice to the depth of historical trauma experienced by many. And it is a trauma that has remained submerged for long years. I mentioned earlier that the history of all 4 of my grandparents can be traced back to what is now Pakistan. And when I began my research in 2013, I felt like partition was a word which had receded in public memory and yet continued to very quietly and painfully linger in private discourse. And I think it sort of surprised me because an event of such scale, an event of such magnitude, which resulted in so many so many incredible consequences in terms of politics, in terms of family life, in terms of the sheer scale of migration, just weren't discussed openly. And when I asked questions about this past, they weren't always welcome, even in my own family. And they were often actually met with more questions. My grandparents and their siblings would ask me, why do you want to know? What would it change? They had all left their homes, they had left their lands, they had left schools and colleges and jobs on the other side. And I think it really still existed as a wound or an incision in their history that they just didn't want to revisit. So they would if I would ask them, tell me about partition, they would ask me, well, what will it change when you know? The past will still be the past, and the past will have no impact on your future. And I think that this was a bit untrue, because their past certainly would have an impact on my future and my present as well. But the anecdotes that did reveal themselves were one of nostalgia, one of longing, one of lament, but anything that touched on the brutality of violence, of why they fled from their homes, proved quite inaccessible. And remembering felt quite difficult. Physically, it looked quite difficult, especially if the story had remained unspoken. Also, I think added to this fact was that I didn't know how to ask the questions. When I think particularly in South Asian families, the act of conversation is something that needs to be practiced among generations. It's not something that comes quite naturally, especially if it's about a history or trauma which we don't know enough about. So I didn't know how I would begin to ask the questions. What topics were off limits? Where was the boundary of my questioning? So I feel like, should I call them refugees? Shall I mention the word Pakistan? Because over the past 75 years, India and Pakistan have gained a new identity as being neighbors, but also sort of antonyms of one another, whereas they really just at one point came from the same land. And I think that I realized that I wasn't given a vocabulary of trauma, and I had to build it as I went along. And oral history really is about, I think, what is said, but also what is unsaid, what is shown in the body, what is shown through movement and gesture and reticence and silence. And I mentioned that I spent time in Canada. I studied to be an artist. I studied to be a traditional metal engraver actually for a decade. And so I was learning how to be an oral historian on the job. I was learning how to ask questions. I was learning how to speak in my own language, because living in Canada for nearly a decade, you also lose the mother tongue. So I was learning how to speak in Urdu, in Hindi, in Punjabi, ask questions of the past in the mother language of the past. And so there were so many questions in my mind. Should I call them refugees? Should I talk about Pakistan? Could I ask about violence? Was there violence? And whenever my questions were met with silence, as they were quite often, the process began to feel quite invasive, because you are literally trying to look into a history that you haven't witnessed but is yours in some way. And so I was forced to look at other forms of remembrance. Eventually, I used the aid of migratory objects to carve a pathway into a pre-partition landscape. And just to give you a sense of what, there were things carried. These were on this, let me compose my thoughts. On the screen are the objects that my family managed to carry during their migration to India. Things as varied as coins, ordinary coins, jewelry, utensils, small handheld weapons. And it's really quite a random assortment from all four of my grandparents. But I began to realize that talking about the object is a way to return. It's like the object is sort of like a portal. It is a catalyst for them to return to the landscape of their homeland. And it encouraged a deeper conversation that extended beyond nostalgia or lament. Holding the object, touching the object, smelling it, looking at it, talking about it, began unearthing stories about their childhoods and about their journeys and about, yes, trains and walking on foot, but also happier times and what life was like in an undivided India. I suppose in those early months, I began to figure out that we were actually constructing a new language to speak about this definitive and historic loss. And it was a language that didn't allow partition to remain confined to my grandparents' past, but it established partition as an event that had emotional hold over my present and naturally my future. On the bottom left corner of the screen is the first object that I sort of discovered. And it was one of the reasons why I became very curious about material culture of partition. What did people carry? This very common question: if your house is burning, what do you carry with you? What is precious? What is precious? What do we consider precious? Is it monetarily valuable? Is it emotionally valuable? And this object is just a vessel, it's a ghada in which lassi was made in my mother's family home in Lahore. And my grand uncle, he's showing me how lassi is made in the photograph. And when he began that act of churning, when he began talking about it, I swear I felt like he was transported back, not just into history, but over this very contentious border between India and Pakistan. And he was transported back to his childhood, and he was walking on the lanes of, his neighborhood in Shahalmi. And it felt so transportive, and it felt so moving that objects can carry history. They are suffused with the past. And I really wanted to explore the idea of learning about the notion of belonging through belongings. So over time, I broadened my study to include others who had carried objects across this newly formed border. I traveled across India, where I live, across Pakistan, which was just a beautiful experience, and something that many people are envious in India for, because it's so difficult to travel to Pakistan. And I traveled across the diaspora to Britain, to North America, to look for objects that people had carried. And it is, it became over time the first and only material archive from partition, which was a bit unusual to me, because as South Asians, we're people that hoard objects. We have so many things in our homes, and yet the idea of looking at an object as a portal into history seemed quite novel to many people. They didn't understand why I wanted to look at their utensils or their shawls or their books to talk about the days that they had left behind. But I feel like it was, this way of looking into history, material memory, is a gentler way to explore things that are still quite difficult to talk about. As I mentioned, the object became a catalyst. And through the object, we learned of the days they had left behind, how the object was used, who gave the object to the person. And it paved the way for larger conversations. So I want to show some examples of objects so that you have insight into what kinds of things actually people carried, things of utilities, things of monetary value, things that could be sold. Okay, I'm just going to go through a series of slides. This is a mortar and pestle. We call it a hammam dasta. It was carried from Karachi to Bombay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Religious items. People carried these kinds of little statues. They carried religious books. This is a beautiful Guru Granth Sahib that was this Sikh prayer book, which was carried from Rawalpindi all the way to Shimla. 2 months after partition, someone went back to Rawalpindi to retrieve it. So needless to say, all of these stories, all of these objects carry stories as well. And they are not only stories of violence, but also stories of courage and stories of friendship and stories of how objects were saved by people and how objects were retrieved over time and how they were buried and how friends took care of them and neighbors took care of them. And I think this is also really what I wanted to construct, was a landscape of partition that was not devoid of violence, but extended beyond just the realm of the violent. Textiles and other cultural artifacts. This is a phulkari bagh, which is over 100 years old, and it's very, very warm. And the woman that carried it from Rawalpindi to Delhi actually had to wear it in August when it was hot and sweltering and also raining, just so that she could make it safely across the border, because her grandmother had threaded it by hand. These are all silk threads, handmade. Another beautiful textile from Multan. This is called loi, carried from Multan to Delhi. Jewelry, of course, was very popular, perhaps the most popular thing that I archived. And it was just a very practical thing because it was monetarily valuable. It could be mortgaged, it could be sold. The other side of the border proved uncertain for many people that didn't have family there, and they would need money to survive. And so sadly, a lot of people had to sell uh, wedding jewelry or heirloom jewelry. Fortunately, this was not sold, but it is a very old-fashioned piece of jewelry. So, and it is quite beautiful as well. Photographs, of course, were also popular. If you had photographs at the time, you carried them, photographs of family. These are my great-grandparents. And actually, this photograph of the man is the only photograph my grandmother has of her father. She was very young when he passed, so this is kind of how she remembers him. She says that when I see the photograph, I know what he was like. But apart from that, I have no memory of him. So how objects remain the last traces of people as well. Documents, of course, this is a British Indian passport. Educational documents. People also carried certificates from work. For instance, a lot of people carried, if they work for the railway, they carried their employee passes and stuff like that because they thought they may get similar jobs on the other side of the border, or of course their educational certificates would allow them to study further on the other side. I have to say that a lot of people missed out on educational opportunities as well because of partition, which is something that I hear often in my interviews, that young students who were in school or who were in grade 10 or 11 could not complete their education, or even younger, because of how it was disrupted by partition. And I think this is really the kind of object that breaks my heart. Locks and keys. And I saw thousands of locks and keys in all different shapes and sizes. There was an absolute disbelief amongst so many people that partition would happen and that it would be permanent. The number of people that I spoke to who really believed that partition was just a passing phase, or there would be soft borders, or you would still be able to travel back and forth, or you could remain where you were even as a minority despite new nations being created, is really sort of heartbreaking. People left their houses locked during the riots and they migrated to safer places and hoped that after the riots they could come back and live there as per normal. I recorded this story of a set of 51 keys. These are not the keys, of course, but they're beautiful, very unique, old-fashioned keys. But this set of 51 keys that a woman had carried to Delhi, and I spoke to her grandson, who I think is in his 60s or 70s now, and he tells me that he recalled as a child this like ring full of 51 keys that his grandmother had carried from Pakistan to India, because she had locked her house 51 times. She had locked every room. She had locked every cupboard. She had locked the drawers in the kitchen. And what is more is that she had employed a local woman to clean the house before they came back, so that the house would be clean, as if they were coming back from vacation. And I think that it really broke his heart that what remained of that house and that land and that childhood was the set of 51 keys. And it is really heartbreaking when you think about it. But I also want to say that what someone carried revealed how much they knew about what partition was going to be like. So if someone managed to send many things from their home or managed to pack up their home, they obviously knew partition would be permanent. But if someone managed to just carry 51 keys and the clothes on their back, then they really didn't think that it was going to be a permanent thing. And they really believed that they would be able to return home. And, I think looking at these things, touching them, feeling them, thinking about the stories that came out from them, I really felt like questions that may have been too direct to ask without aid felt less direct with this kind of where the object was from, how it was used, who gave it to you. It felt like these questions extended beyond the material into the sensorial, into the linguistic, into the ethnographic, and people began to discuss what happened to their families decades ago. And it was not just about archiving the object and the personal experience, but also the diversity of experiences, because for communities that had been marginalized or overlooked or rendered invisible by official history, oral history is a means in which their story can be recorded in their terms, on their words, in their words. And I felt like it was a more holistic understanding of partition and community, looking at it through the realm of storytelling. And in that sense, I think these interviews are sacred, and they served as primary research both for my graduate thesis as well as my first book. When we are first introduced to partition, as I was, we understand it to be this incredible fracture, this very sudden disruptive event that happened overnight or over a number of days and gave way to unthinkable migration and loss. But I think I would say that partition is a process, and to understand how it happened, we need to understand what happened before it that led to the fracture of land and people and relationships. Material possessions may seem like they are just objects. And when I started my interviews, I have to admit that a lot of people I spoke to also thought it was quite comical, as I mentioned, that I came into their houses and looked at these very bizarre things like keys and pens and books. But it is a way for us to build some sense of social ethnography of the time. We can piece together the past by knowing how life was in undivided India. How did people live? What were the objects that they used? What was the landscape? What did they eat? What were their relationships with one another? And it helps us to learn of things not only associated to the violence surrounding partition, but also the largely syncretic life that existed before it, the common life of ordinary people, and how it was fractured by extraordinary means. So I feel like the object is really, it may seem like quite a commonplace thing, but it is really a reservoir of memory if we allow it to be, because objects by their anatomy cannot speak. And so to give voice to an object means to allow it to be permeated with memory, and that only happens if we give it time and allow conversation to occur around it. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but this is such an iconic image. It's probably the most famous border post between India and Pakistan. It's called Wagah, famously called Wagah. And it's a line of a few inches painted on the ground, dividing one country from its neighbor. And it's kind of sort of like, and it's unlike any other border in the world, because on both sides of it, you're going to find people that are essentially the same. People that speak the same language, people that look the same, they eat the same food. The number of times I have been mistaken for a Pakistani is it's so often. And I think that if common Indians and Pakistanis ever meet on the street in places far away from India and Pakistan, like Britain or America or Canada, they have no problems in relating to one another, which is the great paradox of these two nations. But it is important to acknowledge that we passed on the same trauma to our generations originating at partition. And yet anything about the other side remains so inaccessible to us. I don't think that the political history of partition allows us to bridge that inaccessibility. So what remains the most, for me, the most moving and most definitive way is to listen to people's stories on both sides, oral histories. And my attempt to record oral history is an attempt to bridge this very complicated inaccessibility in some way, to show that where there is shared history, there is shared pain and thereby shared loss, and there can be some form of reconciliation in the future. Really, the the trauma and the generational memory of partition should ideally be a whole other topic to discuss. But it is something that when you start thinking about the stories of partition, you can't help but constantly think about it. In fact, my next book is about the generational memory of partition and how it's been passed down. But this border, such a complicated border. I have this photograph that I want to show that I took in 2018 when I was coming back from Karachi. And you see, there is the border between India and Pakistan, and then there is no man's land on either side. And very often in my interviews with people, they spoke about how it felt to cross the border and how they didn't realize when they had crossed the border because the landscape was so similar in India or Pakistan. In 1947, the border was not as fortified as it is today. There was no army personnel, I think, in August at least. There was no wall, there was no barbed wire, there was no gate. So I don't know how people really understood that they had now left India and come to Pakistan, or left Pakistan and entered India. But when I was traveling on foot, I felt like I wanted to feel, I wanted to sort of know what it felt like to leave my homeland and enter my neighbors. And would it feel the same? And of course it did feel the same, because it is essentially the same. But this, I thought, was an extraordinary photo. Please excuse the bad composition of the photo compared to the rest of my presentation. But I did have border police on both sides staring at me. So this is me and my suitcase with 1 foot in no man's land in India and 1 foot in no man's land in Pakistan. And that's the border between us, just these 6 or 7 inches of white line, which has given birth to so many complicated political, geopolitical, ethnographic, social, emotional, familial issues, I would say. And I will end on that kind of saddish note. If you want to know more about my research, this is my book. It's called Remnants of Partition. It is also translated into Hindi, Punjabi, and French, if that is easier for you to read. And of course, I am very happy to answer questions right now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and layered talk. There's so much food for thought there. And while everybody is gathering their thoughts and organizing questions or reflections, I'd like to just start by asking you to expand a bit on the contemporary perceptions of these histories in Pakistan. You mentioned that you were able to travel to Pakistan, and one issue that's often missing from an India-centric discussion is that kind of understanding of the public sphere in Pakistan, how people are processing these issues, and the state of affairs there regarding these objects as well. There are always contested histories of everything, but definitely of the trails of objects and how they figure in the public. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, the word contested history is so interesting, because I found that when it comes to ordinary objects, you have to encourage people to discuss them in depth. The object is, unless the object was sort of monetarily valuable, like a big piece of jewelry or something, it was not really given the same importance, and so hours of discussion with the object would permeate it with importance and history, and only then would it really be acknowledged as a viable source of history, I think. And also within the family, it would become sort of family lore after that. But to your question of going to Pakistan, yes, I think that the great misfortune sometimes of partition, books on partition, projects on partition, is that they remain quite one-sided. And it's not because the scholar doesn't want it to be complete. It's just that there is such inaccessibility to travel to the other side. So I think I was lucky in that way. I got to travel to Pakistan twice and record stories there. But I think that Pakistan's public memory of partition and independence is different than India. Obviously, it means a different thing for Pakistan. And I think as an Indian going to Pakistan, I had to constantly remind myself of that. And I think this goes to the larger mindset of someone who does cross-border stories on any border, I think, of the world, is that there will be constant unlearning on your end and relearning. And I think that I was mentally prepared for that, because when you are born into a certain construct of society, into a certain religion, into a certain country which has a national allegiance to a certain historical event, you take some things as known, like this is how I understand partition since childhood. Obviously, your neighbor may not understand it in the same way. So I think that it was an eye-opening experience. And it taught me that one can feel pride for the country they chose at the time of partition, going to Pakistan, while still feeling loss and belonging for the country they left behind. And it is not, it is complicated when you think of that, but it is not anti-national to think of that, which I think a lot of my interviewees in Pakistan realized as we were talking. There can be pride, national pride, as well as historic longing for something that remains on the other side. And I think that it is a big thing to listen to these stories and be a part of these acknowledgements and be a part of these learnings. And I felt a great responsibility to do justice to the stories I'd recorded in Pakistan and the words that the people had shared with me, even though I may not have agreed with them myself. There were instances as a Hindu in Pakistan, there are certain things that may make you uncomfortable, but you have to remind yourself that this is what happened to the other person, and it has nothing to do with me and everything to do with them. So I must be quite careful with this history. And in that sense, I feel like oral history is quite a collaborative process, particularly if you're writing it down, where you do need to work with the individual quite a bit. Obviously, this entire project is collaborative. It could have never happened only because of me. But I think in Pakistan particularly, it gave me the perspective that was so different to one that I had grown up with. And that is really where the diversity of thought, idea, politics, and everything connected to partition came in. It became a lot more meaningful, I think.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to bring in just 1 minute Sudhir Jain into the conversation, but I'd like to say that this resonates so strongly with those of us who work in West Bengal and in Bangladesh, as I do, where there are narratives around the partition of Bengal and the refugees created out of that moment in West Bengal that are typed in a very tragic sense, that in what became East Pakistan and then what became Bangladesh have a radically different place in their own histories and in their narratives of what became Bangladesh. And only with more access across these borders do these histories become meaningful and comprehensible in a broader sense. They're almost locked away from one another without these kinds of interactions across these borders. And just also briefly, a phrase that came into my mind is that phrase of, we left our keys with our neighbors, which was something that was constantly, referred to in much of the literature of the time, and comes out, I think, of some of the objects that you shared with us. It's such a big part of that time, the time of the uncertainty of the future, but yet the objects carry with them these kinds of histories that you've been able to share with us. There's so much to reflect on there. So I will now pass it over to Sudhir Jain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aanchal. That is a very interesting way of looking at partition. As I mentioned in my chat, my parents are from Gujranwala and Sialkot. My question is, yes, it was Bengal which was partitioned and Punjab which was partitioned. In Bengal, I grew up in Calcutta, by the way, so I have an understanding of Bengal also. Unlike in Bengal, basically Bengalis interchange, Bengali Muslims and Bengali Hindus. In the case of Punjab, are you able to hear me?
Absolutely.
In the case of Punjab partition, there was an interesting mix of people who had to migrate from one country to the other. I'll come to the question, but before that, I'm just laying out the background, which I think many may not know. Into the West Pakistan, a lot of people from Bihar and UP went. They were not Punjabis.
Yeah, Muhajirs.
And from Pakistan, a lot of Sindhis came to India. So it is not just Punjabis. So my question is, when you went over to Pakistan, what was the difference in the attitude of the Muslims who migrated from UP and Bihar versus Muslims who were Punjabis?
So it is a fundamental question of Punjabi versus Muhajir. Right?
Yeah.
And the Muhajir identity still continues to dominate. Though I have to say that it is different in different cities. In Lahore, you will not find, I feel like Punjabi Muslims have pretty much assimilated into the Punjabi society. Whereas if you go to places in Sindh like Karachi, where there is not just Muhajirs, but Hindus that continue to stay in parts of Sindh, the situation is quite different. And similarly, like in India, where the tag of refugee or Sharnarthi followed people for a long time, the tag of Muhajir still does dominate the identity. The Sindhi, particularly Hindu Sindhi experience, is so interesting because they are a people that entirely lost homeland. They have no, like at least with Punjab or Bengal, we have some tie to some form of land, which means some sort of language and food and culture continues to thrive in that place. But with the Sindhi, it's quite an extraordinary loss of everything. So I think the difference, I'm trying to think of how people speak about the identity of being Muhajir, and it is not one way to speak about it. There is obviously a multiplicity of ways depending on people's experiences. And I'm wary to generalize with anything with partition because it's so complex. Human beings are such complex beings and they contradict their own feelings sometimes. So I feel whereas some people have thrived from that identity, other people have felt persecuted in the employment space or the educational space or the space of personal belonging. You can feel like you don't belong in your mind as well. Because particularly for people that migrated from India to East Pakistan and then to Pakistan with the creation of 1971, there were multiple migrations in the region. Now, I don't know how much I've answered your question, but this topic is very layered and much to speak about.
If I may just, my question was limited to the extent of that limited interaction you had and whether you saw any marked difference in the reaction. That was all.
Right. Yes, of course.
I just want to add to that a little bit that there is a history of the Muhajir in what became East Pakistan and in Bangladesh as well, but there isn't, I think, the equivalent understanding of how those politics transformed, partially because of the creation of Bangladesh.
Exactly. It's quite interesting how 1971 sort of swallows 47 when you think of the eastern border and how porous the border continued to be for so many decades on the eastern side, how migration continued for so long.
Yes, absolutely. I want to make sure that there's time for anyone else who has any question.
I think there were a couple of questions in the chat, Neilesh.
I see a question. Why do I get the impression that the current discussion is very anti-Punjabi? I'm not sure where this is coming from or going, but I don't know if...
And I thought there was an earlier one. Maybe I missed it.
No, the conversation is not anti-Punjabi. I am Punjabi. I feel sometimes the conversation of partition is dominant Punjabi.
Right. Well, there's a question before that I just want to address,
So
although I think you mentioned it.
Sharing my screen is that okay? Is that helpful if I stop sharing my screen? Oh, there you go.
Well, there's a question about how your experience was in Pakistan. You did address it a bit, but it asks how you felt with same food, same language, transport, roads and houses, how you felt while living there.
My first city that I visited in Pakistan was Lahore, a city where my maternal grandparents were both from. They were from Andurun Shahar. So I felt like I was returning to a home I'd never been, because it just, also being from Delhi, Lahore looks physically quite similar. But anecdotally, there was this one thing that happened to me where I was, and this is just a funny anecdote now. I was getting my nails done in a manicure, in a salon in Pakistan, and this manicurist is talking to me, and I'm speaking in Urdu, and she asked me, "Ki Baji, kahan se ho? Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Delhi." And I think that she just wasn't expecting that. And she dropped my hands and she lowered her voice and she said, "You're from India? Why do you look the same? Why do you sound the same? Why are you wearing the same clothes as us? How much do potatoes cost in India? How many times a day do you eat meat? Where is your sindoor?" And I think that it encapsulated for me how little common people know about people on the other side of the border, how similar we really are. It was quite heartbreaking, and I realized she wasn't prepared to meet someone that was exactly like her.
Great. I'm going to take these questions in order. I'm reading out another question on the chat. Is the next book going to be about trauma? Will you be addressing memory via psychology? Are you going to collect interviews again for the next book?
I had been collecting them for many years, in fact, and the next book is coming out in April. It is about trauma. It is about other things, not just trauma. It is about generational memory. So there are a series of conversations with second, third, fourth generations of partition impacted families to look at the ways that partition has disseminated down or not in some cases, and to look at things like silence and migration and otherness, but also things like hope and love and friendship that grew at the time of partition, which I feel is quite important, to have multiple lenses to view the event that are not limited only to violence or trauma.
Thank you. I will now turn to Neha.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. Thank you so much for your presentation, Aanchal. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to reading your book. My question is regarding, you mentioned in your presentation that when you were wanting to know about partition from your family, you were met with silence, and that led you to do this research on objects. So after your book has been written and you're now writing another book, how has your book been received in India, and are people talking more about it? Also in the context of that partition is politicized so much, with Modi government trying to do partition horror day, etc.
It's such an important question, really. And I feel like the remembrance of partition exists in a twofold way in the subcontinent, where there is private conversations happening within family. There is hugely charged political conversations like partition horrors, Remembrance Day, and they seem pretty, whereas they should really be enmeshed, they seem quite divorced from one another, ironically. So to answer your first question first, has the publication of the book led people to talk about partition? The very easy answer is yes, of course. And there are a number of factors to it, which are not just limited to me. It is the fact that the generation that lived through partition is really dying out. And so I think a lot of younger people are realizing that if we would like to know about a history that remains on the other side, the people to tell that history are not going to be here for many more years. So there is a lot of active conversation and active recording of memory that is happening in both India and Pakistan at the moment. And I think, yes, it was propelled by Remnants, but it's not the only reason. There are many, many other writers that are pushing this way of thinking, this method of conversation. Anam Zakaria, brilliant Pakistani historian, oral historian, who writes on partition and 1971 in Kashmir, comes to mind. Kavita Puri, who is encouraging these conversations in Britain, comes to mind. Sam Dalrymple, who is writing on multiple partitions across India, Pakistan, the Northeast, Kashmir, comes to mind. So, and they're all younger people, which should tell you that there is curiosity within younger people. So that's the first thing. To your second question of partition being politicized. I think it always has. It's just been, one moment. I think it's just being done on a more national scale now. If you think about it, the creation of the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, happened as a result of partition, all the way back decades ago, right after partition. So I think that now we're just seeing it in a more overt way, and partition is being wielded and probably misused to fit political agenda. That's all I'll say. But it's not new. It's just more overt.
Great, thank you for that. I'll now turn to Alicia.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'll turn my video on. Oh, hi. So that was lovely. Like, thank you so much for sharing everything. I think my question's almost like twofold, because like I'm a Punjabi person, and like my parents, like my dad's side's from Amritsar, so it's like his story about partition is like completely different, right? Like our lineage has been there for so many years, so they didn't have to go through the whole migration thing. But on my mom's side, you have her coming from Lahore, right? So my grandma still talks about the fact that like she never got to see her like home, and like they left everything behind, right? But like growing up in Canada, so I got both perspectives. And I feel like when you're a Punjabi, like you're raised to be just like really proud of the fact that you survived, and like your generation has survived something so traumatic, right? So I didn't really understand like the significance of partition as a person until like very recently. So I studied law and I work in like Indigenous legal affairs. And it wasn't until I worked in like reconciliation with the Canadian government that I understood like the impact of like partition, right? So I think like what I'm trying to understand is like, I think reconciliation has been really pivotal for the Indigenous peoples of Canada to get that fair like self-actualization that they're right, like for the rights that they're deserving. So do you see like in India, like something similar progressing in terms of like reconciliation for like survivors or like individual, just for like healing purposes? Like do you see like a trend coming out for like this anti-colonial mindset coming in to like rejuvenate like Indian cultural things for like healing?
It's interesting you say that, and every time someone asks me something about decolonization or the effects of decolonization, I can't help but think that over the last 75 years of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh fighting 4 wars, creating a new kind of very complicated relationship, the original moment of the creation of these nations has almost been rendered like inconsequential. Like the number of people that mention decolonization or partition as an impact of decolonization is very small compared to the number of people that talk about the problems between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and India and Bangladesh. But of course, reconciliation has proved to be a valuable tool all over the world when it comes to ethnographic and social and political conflict. The thing about that is, and this is something an interviewee mentioned to me, and I really think he's so right in it, that for some form of reconciliation, there needs to be some form of truth that comes before. So there is truth, and then there is reconciliation. But where the idea of truth is so divergent and means different things for the countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, I don't know if we can I don't know if we can decide on what is true to be able to reconcile it. So I don't know if any form of official reconciliation will work. And because the only reason I say that is that it requires some form of empathy. Without empathy, you can have no reconciliation for this region. And I don't see that happening at the moment with the current government. Even, someone mentioned Partition Horrors Remembrance Day. Ideally, that should have been discussed with the 3 nations and come up with a date that was relevant to all 3. But I believe the kind of reconciliation that can happen is through ordinary people, through conversation, through projects of oral history, which is why I'm such an advocate for actually talking to people from the other side too. I think I spend a lot of my days telling people what Pakistan is like and how similar it is to India, and how common you may feel when you go there, when the veneer of being in Pakistan wears off. I felt like I was part of that landscape because the landscape welcomed me as a part of it. You know, I have family history in Lahore, so Lahore is mine. But I think that I don't know whether any official reconciliation, how that'll work. I can't say. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised, but I can say that it requires huge amounts of empathy to be able to listen and acknowledge and know what is true for the other person may not be true for you, and that's also okay.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, and we'll go in order with Varsha and then Victor.
Hi, Aanchal. So grateful for this session that I've never met you in person. I come from India, so it's so good to hear you. And the previous question I had asked about the next book and the interviews and the memory insight, because like right now I'm kind of at this stage of my life where I am like trying to understand how my family took that trauma of partition and what had happened, because I have lost my grandparents and I'm still like unraveling things. So yeah, I know very few things, and like you said, you did not know initially how to start questioning, the right way to question, the right things to ask, what are the boundaries. So I have no idea, but I know very few things. I just want to mention, I don't know if I will ever be able to meet you, but if you like, I would love to interview or contribute in any way or some way. Maybe I'm a Sindhi, so yeah.
I would recommend you read someone called Saz Agarwal and Nina Sabnani. They write on oral histories of Sindh, and Rita Kothari, of course.
Okay.
It may make you feel a bit closer to that landscape.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much for the recommendation.
And when you do come back to India, you should go to Kutch, which is the closest where you will hear the Sindhi spoken in Sindh. Kutch in Gujarat. It's probably the closest landscape.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've never been there. Been to Gujarat, and I'm based out of Jaipur right now. Okay. So yeah.
Another hub where Sindhis came and migrated to Jaipur, Rajasthan.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Now the last question for the evening will be Victor's.
Thanks very much. So this was really a fascinating talk. I learned so much, and I really congratulate you again on this amazing project. I do want to ask you a little bit about your website or the museum of material memory, which seems like a really interesting project. And you know, it's I guess a way of making what you're doing accessible. I mean, everyone potentially has, you know, access to these kinds of archives and the materials that you post there. So I think it's a really, really fascinating project. I don't know if we have time for you to maybe say a little bit more about it. But one question I had is, and maybe it draws on the earlier question about reconciliation. The objects that you're looking at, have they moved in one direction or both directions?
Multiple.
So from present day Pakistan to India, and from India to Pakistan,
and
both ways.
sometimes then from India to East Pakistan, to Pakistan, to the UK, North America. They have led multiple lives. Right.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. Anyway, I was just wondering if you maybe wanted to say a few words about the museum. It really is fascinating, and the images are beautiful, and it's really quite compelling. So I'm going to explore it a bit more.
I can't take credit for that entirely. When I was working on the research for Remnants, a lot of people, you know, over time, any project does gain a bit of press, especially if it's weird, as Remnants was at the beginning. And so a lot of people started reaching out to me saying, we have these things and come to our house. We are in, you know, Srinagar, we are in Ranchi, we are in Karachi. And I couldn't always go to these places because of travel restrictions. And, you know, I was in my early 20s. I didn't have enough money to go everywhere. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to have a kind of digital crowdsourced archive that people could submit stories of aged objects and write about those objects and feel empowered to write about them, because it would make them ask questions inside their homes. And so I shared this idea with a school friend of mine. In fact, we went to middle school, high school together, and she said that this sounds like a great idea. Why don't we extend the timeline beyond partition? So the objects on the Museum of Material Memory have really nothing to do with partition, though some may be from that time. They are simply objects from the Indian subcontinent that have accumulated age and stories with that age. And we invite people to write about them and take photographs of them and upload them. We work with them to upload them to this site, which is digital and accessible to people from everywhere. And I think that, a physical museum is wonderful because you get to see things, but the digital archive is accessible to people across borders. So a border is fortified, but a digital archive kind of transcends that. And the other thing it allows, which is extraordinary, is it allows people to see that the same object is used in different countries. So someone from Lahore can look at an object used in Calcutta and say, wait a minute, my mother uses that object. It happened with a Bengali bonti. We did a story of a cutter, like it is used to cut vegetables in a Bengali kitchen, but there is also a different bonti used to cut fish, and there is a different bonti used to cut different vegetables in Punjab. And so I feel like when people see objects that they recognize, it makes them feel closer to the landscape they come from, and physical borders may disappear a little bit in that thought process, just temporarily even, but a little bit. And I think that's really what we want with the museum, to be a cross-border archive where the subcontinent is one big mass that has objects that people recognize and want to talk about. And of course, it is a homegrown archive because it's crowdsourced, so it comes from the ground.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. I think we are now at time, and I think I speak for everyone else. I'm pretty sure I do, and I will say that we really hope that we could have hosted you here in person, and we look forward to that opportunity in the future. And we thank you for this wonderful talk, about which we will have so much to say in our class tomorrow. And at that, I will wish you a good day and then good night to everyone here. And I'll ask you just to stay just for a minute after we close this session. But we are now closing this session formally. Thank you so much.